Welcome to the Modscast. I'm going to talk about something that hasn't been too widely reported in the mainstream media here, and that is the violence at the G20 meeting in Hamburg. Now, again, as with most of these things, politics aside, if you got problems with Merkel, you got problems with Trump, you got problems with, or with the agenda, I want to focus on the unrest and the violence, because we got a major issue here. First of all, I want to be very clear. At no point am I condoning violence or recommending violence. Anyone who knows me knows that that's not. I mean, I'm a guy about reason, articulation, language. It's what we have to solve problems. The reason we are where we are, the reason we are a great nation, is that we haven't used violence to solve problems, that we've had transitioned power peaceably countless times through the election process. Okay, people aren't happy, but and yeah, there's been violence along the way, and that's always been a problem. It's not it's as a means of initiating your problem or your grievance. It's childish. Now, that being said, Heinlein's great about this in Starship Troopers. Probably one of the reasons the book's controversial, and that is violence has resolved more disputes in history than anything. The historical record shows that. Now, doesn't mean it's the first thing you go to, but people choose to use it, and then you have to use it to respond to that. As he puts it, people say violence never solves anything, but there's plenty of civilizations who believe that, who have been, quote, solved by violence because they adhered to that belief when someone else came along who didn't believe that. And that's a historical fact. You just can't argue with it. Unfortunate, but until human nature is fundamentally and radically transformed through some, I don't know, miracle, quite frankly, there's always going to be people who choose to attempt to use violence to resolve their issues. Children do it at first. You have to teach them not to. It's a childish impulse, an immature one. But for those of you unfamiliar, and probably because, again, you haven't heard much about it, there was an organization of rioters, or protesters is what they called themselves, and the media called them protesters. But as you can see, I'll put links to videos below. And they called their operation Welcome to Hell. Their protest operation, Welcome to Hell. Okay? You're not planning to show up and protest and have a dialogue about your grievances and the things that you're concerned about. If Welcome to Hell is what you say, what you call yourself, your organization, your mission there, okay? Your job is to attack people and make them miserable through violence, through any means necessary, which is by any means necessary, bam, yeah? That organization, if you're not familiar, look it up. The footage you'll see shows violence. It's quite frightening, actually. I mean, there were, I think, they thought there were going to be 20,000. I don't know. I think the guesstimates are somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 people, but masked. We've talked about masks before. If you wear a mask, it's because you know you're wrong. Hordes of people. Looks like an army. Although someone has pointed out, if a pile of building materials makes a house, then that was an army, because they're very disorganized. But there they were, throwing things, attacking people who were associated with Lauren Southern. Found that people who just were in pictures near her found themselves being attacked by these people when they couldn't get to Lauren Southern herself. She's a conservative vlogger from, reporter really, from Canada. But the German government knew. They tried to get more police officers, but weren't able to. And then they allowed the looting and the rioting to go on. Now, this was true in Baltimore through Freddie Gray, to an extent, obviously, also where the police just stood back and let this thing happen. If you look at the video, they're looting stores that are broken open. I mean, are they really there to make a point? Are they really protesters who are there to make a point? Or are they there to create violence? And the answer is quite clear. Okay? They were there in the interest of creating violence and to dare the authorities to do something about it. But these are children. Children who use violence. I mean, a bully, if you let a bully push kids around and, Adults come in and break things up and say, hey, that's not how we settle disputes. And sometimes they have to use force to do it. You go in and you physically pull a kid off of another kid, right? And push him back against the wall and say, get a hold of yourself. You could say that teacher's using, or that, adult is using violence, okay? They're responding to violence in order to curtail violence, to stop violence. And they're trying to solve the problem. It's controlled violence. It's not the out-of-control violence of the person who says, I'm going to use violence to solve my grievance. It's a person who's using violence to solve violence. Now, again, I'm not encouraging violence, all right? As always, what I want us to do is be thinking hard about this. I am recognizing that there are people who want to use violence and see it as the means to achieve their end. And if you admit that into the conversation, you've already lost civilization. Civilization is based on the premise that the only time you use violence is in response to violence. No matter the grievance, no matter how unfair you feel you've been treated, the adult understands that no matter what, I cannot resort to violence to achieve this, unless violence has been done to me. Now, as many people have noted, what we've done is said that words are violence, right? But words, they're not. No one can make you angry enough to attack someone. If they attack you, you attack back. You do that survival, right? That's a basic instinct. But this G20 summit, and again, the way it was handled, and you'll see it in the footage, as I mentioned, the looting, these are military camps drawn up against one another. Dialogue's not possible there. Civilization and savagery, as we've said many times. Heinlein, as I mentioned, says violence, never solved anything, but it solved the Holocaust. That is, the controlled response to violence, to the violence of the Holocaust and Hitler's aggression, could only be responded to with violence and defeated with violence. Slavery in the United States. Founding fathers knew they had a ticking time bomb on their hands when they put the documents together. They knew they needed to establish the nation on a firm footing with regard to the rest of the world, and in particular with regard to independence from Great Britain, before they could deal with the issue of slavery. Some obviously were very pro, and that's a problem, pro-slavery that is, but they left that, and therefore the defining American moment is 1861 to 1865, American Civil War, where we were forced to decide if we were going to be what we said, and we had to decide that with violence. John Brown said, I don't think that the sin of slavery will be purged from this nation except by blood. And he was right. Now, violence solved that issue. Now, let me be perfectly clear again. And when I say violence solved that problem, I mean people instigated violence in defense of something wrong. So the southern states seceded from the Union, fired on Fort Sumter, and the North was left with using violence in response to their violent insurrection and violent defense of something which we know to be morally egregious and utterly unconscionable, and that is the slavery of our fellow human beings. I've talked elsewhere about indifference, and this is a classic example of that. Those who see no difference between those who instigate violence in defense of something and those who use violence in response to violence. To suggest that there's no difference between the person who walks up and punches someone or assaults them, between their use of violence and the use of violence of that person who's been assaulted in response to that. So if I get punched and punched back, that I am the equivalent of that person. That it's violence. Either way, violence never solved anything. And violence solves violence. And it has. Now, if you look historically, Nazi aggression, the Civil War, instigators of violence usually come from the wrong side of the moral question. And they bank on your unwillingness to use violence in response. And they'll bank on civilization. It's characteristic of evil that it is frightened. We tend to think of evil as scary, but we forget that evil is actually quite terrified of good because it doesn't understand it. It doesn't understand sacrifice, selflessness. It doesn't understand those things because it's ultimately self-consumed. So, what evil wants you to do is not fight back. because it's terrified. These people in Antifa wearing masks, and I'll put a link to video. Sargon has a great video on the Young Turks coverage of the riots in Hamburg. And you'll see these people showing up in masks, thousands of them showing up in masks. And then there's one point in the video, it shows footage of them getting rid of their costumes in a dumpster and then blending in with the crowd. This is the lowest form of human life. Again, not to say they should be killed, but it's an ideology that cannot be reasoned with. You will hear in the Young Turks video that Sargon takes apart them defending it, saying, "Oh, this is started back in '99 in Seattle with the World Trade Organization." You know, these people. Okay, you know, Andrew Klavan's hilarious about this too. You know, people who are streaming, you know, Antifa, anti-capitalists, anti-globalists who are streaming their video on their iPhones, right? Who are networking with their technology created by capitalism. They don't even have the strength of their own convictions. What they do is they take the good things that you've given and use them against people. Sargon's very good on the alles für alle thing, the German thing, everything for everyone. Well, that means nothing for anybody. You are entitled to the fruits of your labor. People who want to use violence to overturn that, they don't really care about it. See, the thing about the 1999 WTO, I was teaching at the University of Washington at the time. And my colleagues there were saying, well, you're going to let your kids out to go down to the WTO protests. And I thought, well, if it's a protest, shouldn't they be skipping class? Isn't that the point? I mean, isn't that the message they want to send? Because I'm the man now, right? Because I'm the teacher. Most of my colleagues didn't understand that. And the front page of the Seattle Times was a guy kicking down the Nike Town door in Nikes. Okay, really? You know, they'll destroy a Starbucks and then they'll go get their lattes. This isn't legitimate stuff. This is an outlet of violence, an outlet to indulge the basest part of humanity, which is the wanton destruction of property and the taking of things that aren't yours. We would never tolerate it in a child. We would discipline that child. If we failed to discipline that child, that would be our fault. Heinlein's very good on this too. Okay, if your adult dog is crapping in your house, whose fault is it? And you've had him since he was a puppy, whose fault is that? It's not the dog's fault, right? He argues that there's no such thing as a juvenile delinquent because a juvenile doesn't know their duties. And a delinquent is someone who fails to recognize and observe his duties, his or her duties, yeah? Okay, but this is the worst kind, and it banks on you giving into it. The brown shirts in Germany in the 30s, they banked on the fact that decent people just wouldn't fight back, and they went and intimidated. And that the authorities wouldn't fight back, and the authorities didn't fight back. As the video from Sargon will note, there were more police officers injured than protesters. Okay? What is up with that? What is up with that? That's ridiculous. That means the police officers who were this oppressive force, right, with all this strength and power, and right, the power of the state, and all this equipment, okay? You want to suggest there's no difference between them? Of course there's a difference. They're not even using violence to defend themselves, let alone defend society, which is their job, which is their purpose. Okay? This, and the Young Turks talking about in America, that a cop would have done this or that and the other thing. Well, they should. Okay? You're not helping people. Your job is to help the society. All right? And if people are going to start destroying property and taking things, okay, that's a violation of the individual's rights, the rights of that business owner. And your job is to defend the rights of the individual. Not allow them to do it, figuring you'll sort it out later. And the fear to recognize that because you are using force in response to force, there's a difference. And you're right and justified in using it to protect other people. Now, you want to talk about Gandhi, passive resistance, Percy Shelley, love. Okay, all very noble thoughts. Christ, the example which informed the Western world for centuries, right? I remember after 9/11, you know, people of the Christian faith said, well, we have to turn our eyes to God. My response was, well, that just gives them a clear shot at my throat. And my daughter was had just turned 1. Yeah. And I thought, well, I can make that choice for myself, but if I allow myself to be killed, then how's my daughter going to be assured of that choice? And all of a sudden I realized I don't have a choice. This is that contract with the past and the future generations that I talk about in other videos, right? I have to be willing to respond with violence to protect my children, to protect the future, because I'm not Christ. Now I'll model reasonable, rational discourse for insofar as possible. But it was a classic case on September 11th of where you recognize, I mean, all the policies for dealing with hijackers to that point had been based on the idea that it was more desirable to be alive than dead, a very Western concept. So you let them take control of the plane, you land it, they issue demands, you respond, that's how it works. But then they flew the planes into buildings. And it became clear that their idea of life and our idea of life were very different things. And at that point, you want to talk about difference. There's such a profound difference in definition and understanding. The very idea of life and death. Between that extreme faction of Islam that sees death as desirable and our entirely Western thing which suggests that you should always want to live another day. That discussion is no longer possible. Because at its core terms, again, I've talked about this in difference, at its core, the very basic difference between life and death, you do not see them the same way. Which means your language is not the same. And discourse is no longer available between that extreme faction. Okay? And that's a problem. Douglas Murray has some other great videos on, and has written a book on the strange death of Europe, which I'm looking forward to reading. And he talks about our unwillingness to defend Western values. We can have all the good stuff in the world, but if you don't recognize that for all its warts, as I've said, it's worth defending, it's worth fighting for. And we have to make that choice. We have to. I talked about our duty to keep informing people, but we have a duty to fight and to respond to force and defend people with force. The idea that that's gone and they just need to be understood, they're not really that concerned about it. They're not concerned about Nike, they're not concerned about Apple, they're not concerned about corporations. They claim that in order to provide a cover for them to be violent and to try to matter. And we all want to matter in some way. I get that. But they've decided that they can use violence to try to matter, and they can bank on our unwillingness to use violence in response because we're decent people. And again, like children who test your limits and push things until you respond and discipline them. That's how bullies work. That's how children work. And there's only one way that they learn. Now again, I'm not promoting wanton acts of violence. I never would. But I will assert the difference between initiating violence and responding to violence. There's a very profound difference. And the failure to recognize that, as I've said, that indifference, that inability to see that difference is insanity. And it's suicidal. Because you have to do right. You have to do right. And you sit there and say, well, I wouldn't, I can't win the argument. Look, it's not a rational argument when bricks start being thrown in firebombs. Okay. Now you're talking about people who want to be right. They don't care if they do right. I've written in a blog about it. Evil doesn't care about ends. It's more concerned with means, with getting you to be so freaked out about ends that you'll do anything in the now. You'll throw bricks, you'll steal property, you'll do whatever. And that's not it. That's wrong. You're doing wrong. The use of violence is to initiate in response to any grievance other than violence done against you is wrong. But to not use force to respond to violence done against others or against yourself is also wrong. It's irresponsible and it's idealistic and childish. For us, not for Christ. And there were people who, Dietrich Bonhoeffer struggled. You talk about Gandhi, yeah? Dietrich Bonhoeffer struggled with what he saw Gandhi doing. because he was in Germany, and it's quite clear that had passive resistance, yeah, people tried to passively resist the brown shirts. They didn't have a decent conscience. They didn't have a sense of goodness. They had a sense of, we're going to achieve the perfect state, so we have to get rid of you. Had Gandhi tried what he did in India to the British rulers in India, who had a conscience, who had a common law system based in Christianity that, took a long time but responded, those things work. They wouldn't have worked in Nazi Germany. Bonhoeffer understood that. The Germans would have rounded him up, shot him. They don't care. And the vast majority of people, being decent people, wanting to avoid violence, would have looked the other way. There's a difference. There is. So when you look at these videos and watch these things, understand, okay, these people, this black bloc as they're called, Antifa, they're terrorist organizations designed to use violence and fear to achieve a political end. They need to be met, resisted, and overcome, not parlayed with. It needs to be made clear to them that this is unacceptable conduct. And you will not be allowed, okay? And you say, well, there were peaceful protesters too. Okay, well, here's the deal. If you're peacefully protesting, and I've said this elsewhere, if you're peacefully protesting and someone starts throwing a brick, guess what? You cross to the other side. That is what you do. And you stand against the violence. Because then you go, we're unified. I may disagree with you on all these things, but I do agree with you that we're not going to use violence. You cross over, and then guess what? You're going to have to use force to stop the violence of those who are initiating it. Because that's doing right. Doing right is to cross over. Being right is to stay out, trying to be right, or being obsessed with being right is staying on the side where people are using violence and letting yourself be identified with them. And then screaming, well, how could you respond with force? We were peacefully protesting. Yeah, but you were standing in a group of people who were throwing bricks and firebombs. It's the same thing. It's to suggest that the Israeli response to Palestinian attacks is the same. It's not. Okay? If the Palestinians are lobbing rockets at you and you respond and you destroy where they're lobbing rockets from, and they put the rockets in with children in schools and hospitals, okay, there's not a moral equivalency. There's not. To say that they're the same, they're both terrorists, that's insane, it's indifferent, and it's insane. And reveals that you're more obsessed with being right than with doing right. Again, let me reiterate, I'm not advocating violence. Initiating violence is a means of resolving conflict. What I am saying is when people initiate violence, you have an obligation to respond with force to stop that. Not lethal force, unless absolutely necessary. But you have to respond with force. It can't be reasoned with. And it must be called what it is, which is cowardice and evil. This is not a war between civilizations, whether it's Antifa or ISIS or whatever, as I've said many times. It's a war between civilization and savagery. Civilization says you do not initiate violence for a grievance, ever, no matter the extent of the grievance. But you respond with force when violence is done against you. And violence is not words or policies or perceived injustices. Those have to be worked out because we're not going to have a perfect society. And if you think violence is the means to resolve imperfections in society, you cannot be a part of civilization, because civilization, that is to say people living in cities, if you look at the root, is based on people who get together and decide we're not going to war with one another when we have a problem. We're going to try and find a way to solve it. That doesn't involve violence. And we're going to band together so that people who want to use violence to solve things have to come into our walls, have to attack us. And we will defend our city. We will defend what you are defending is the solving of problems without violence. You have to use violence to defend that sometimes. You have to use force. And you have to be willing to do that, because that's doing right. To defend something which is nobler and better and brings out the best in us. As hard as it is. And that is to solve things peaceably with reason and discourse. And not to respond like children, passionately, violently lashing out. Doing right, not being right. Thanks for watching. Cheers.